On a cold and rainy night, a poor young widow who had almost nothing left in the world to give stopped on a dark street for a filthy, shivering old woman that more than 100 people had already stepped around and hurried past. Everyone else had looked at that broken old figure slumped against the wall, at her torn and dirty clothes and her matted hair and the confusion in her eyes, and had decided in a single glance that she was a drunk, or a beggar or someone else's problem, and had walked on. But the young widow did not walk on. She knelt down in the cold rain beside a stranger who could give her nothing, and she took off her own thin coat and wrapped it around those trembling shoulders, and she said the words that would change both of their lives forever. "You are safe now. I have got you." And she had no idea, kneeling there in the rain with the last of her money in her pocket and an empty cupboard at home, that the ruined old woman she had just decided to save was one of the wealthiest people in the entire country, and that the smallest act of kindness she had ever performed was about to grow into the largest harvest of her life. Before I begin, let me ask you to do one small thing for me. Tell me, down in the comments, the name of the place you are listening from tonight, because it warms my old heart to see how far these stories travel. And if you have ever, even once, been the person who stopped when everyone else kept walking, or if you have ever been the one on the ground praying that just one soul would stop, then this story is for you. And I want you to stay with me all the way to the end, because the harvest that grows from one cold and rainy night is something you are not going to forget. Now let me tell you the story. But first, come out to my garden with me a moment, because this morning I was harvesting the pumpkins, and there is something the pumpkin has been teaching me for 60 years that the whole world keeps forgetting. Come and look at this one, this great heavy golden thing I can barely lift into my basket. Do you know where this began? It began as one single seed. One flat, pale, unremarkable little seed, no bigger than my thumbnail, the kind of thing you would never look at twice, the kind of thing you could hold in the palm of your hand and think, there is nothing here, this is nothing at all. And that is the first great secret of the pumpkin, my friends. You do not plant a pumpkin seed because of what it looks like. It looks like nothing. You plant it in faith. You press that plain little nothing of a seed down into good soil, and you tend it, and you wait, and from that one unremarkable seed there comes a great sprawling vine, and from that vine there comes this, a fruit so large and so heavy and so golden that it can feed a whole family through the longest and hardest winter there is. And here is the second secret, and it is even better than the first. Look at the skin of this pumpkin. It is dusty. It is lumpy and rough and plain. It is exactly the kind of humble, unlovely thing that a careless eye at the market would pass right over, reaching instead for something shinier. But you take a knife to it and you split it open, and oh my friends, inside it is deep gold and sweet and rich, enough to fill every belly at the table. And more than that, inside there are seeds. 100 seeds, 200, more than you could ever count, and every single one of them is another whole harvest waiting to happen. Another vine, another winter's worth of food, another gift to give away. You cannot judge what a thing holds inside it, my friends, by the plainness of its skin. The dustiest, humblest, most overlooked pumpkin in the whole patch is very often the one that is full to bursting with sweetness and with life. And there is one last thing the pumpkin taught me, kneeling there in the dirt this morning. The vine that bears the heaviest fruit is the humble one, the low one, the one that stays down close to the ground and asks for nothing. It does not climb and show off. It just spreads out quietly along the earth, doing its patient work. And it is that lowly, humble, close-to-the-ground vine that carries the greatest treasure of the whole garden. So that is the pumpkin's teaching, and I want you to carry it with you tonight. Kindness is a seed. It is small and plain, and it looks like nothing at all in the moment you give it. You plant it in good soil, asking nothing back, half forgetting you ever planted it at all. And then one ordinary day, when the winter of your life is at its coldest and you have nothing left, the harvest comes. Heavy. Golden. Enough to carry you all the way through. I thought about all of that this morning, lifting my pumpkins into the basket, because the story I want to tell you is about a poor woman who planted a seed of kindness on a cold and rainy night, for a plain and broken stranger that everyone else had passed right by, and about the enormous golden life-changing harvest that grew, in time from that one small seed. So let me tell you about her. Her name was Della Monroe, and if you had passed her on the street in those days, you would very likely have been one of the people who did not look twice. She was 32 years old, though the exhaustion in her face made her look older. And she wore the same 2 coats and the same worn shoes through every season. And she moved through the world with the particular tiredness of a person who is holding a whole life together with nothing but her own 2 hands and the sheer stubborn refusal to let it fall. She lived, with her small daughter, in a tiny rented house at the edge of town, the kind of house where the pipes froze in winter and the roof complained in the rain, and she worked 2 jobs and sometimes 3, and it was still, most months, not quite enough. To understand Della, you first have to understand the hole in the middle of her life, the shape of the person who was missing from it. Because Della had not always been alone. 3 years before this story begins, she had a husband, and his name was Sam Monroe, and he was a firefighter. Sam was one of those rare people who seem to have been built, from the very beginning, out of courage and warmth in equal measure, a big, laughing gentleman who ran toward danger for a living, and came home every night and read bedtime stories in silly voices. Della used to say that she had fallen in love with him the first time she watched him carry a stranger's groceries across an icy parking lot without being asked, just because he saw someone struggling and could not help. That was Sam all the way through. He was a man who ran toward people. When everyone else in the world was running away from the fire, Sam Monroe was the one running into it. It was who he was. It was, in the end, how she lost him. Because 3 years before, there had been a fire in an old apartment building on the east side of the city, a fast and terrible fire that took hold in the middle of the night, and Sam had gone in, the way he always went in. He had carried out one family, and then he had gone back for another. And he had carried out a mother and her 2 small children through smoke so thick you could not see your own hand. And he had gotten them to the door and into the arms of the other firefighters. And then someone had said there was still a child on the 4th floor. And Sam Monroe, who had a small daughter of his own asleep at home, did not hesitate for even 1 second. He went back in. He found the child. He got the child to a window and into the reach of a ladder. And the child lived. That child is alive today because of him. But the floor came down before Sam could follow. And Della Monroe became a widow at 29, with a 3-year-old daughter and a folded flag in a city that called her husband a hero, which was true, and which did not pay a single one of the bills that came after. The years after Sam died were the kind of years that would have broken a great many people, and there were nights in the beginning when they very nearly broke Della too. There was the grief, first of all, the enormous bottomless grief of losing the other half of yourself, which does not go away so much as it slowly learns to walk beside you. But grief, as anyone who has carried it knows, does not excuse you from the electric bill. And so on top of the grief there came the long, grinding avalanche of everything else. There was the debt from before, and the debt that came after, the funeral, the months when she could not work because she could barely stand. There was the little rented house, and the rent that climbed a little higher every year while her wages did not climb at all. And there was Maisie. Maisie Monroe was 6 years old now, a bright, watchful, tender-hearted little girl with her father's easy laugh and her mother's stubborn chin, and she was the reason Della got up every single morning, no matter how heavy the morning was. Maisie had been only 3 when her father died, too young to truly keep the memory of him, and that was its own particular sorrow for Della, that her daughter would grow up knowing Sam only through photographs and stories, through the folded flag on the shelf and the fire helmet Della could not bring herself to give away. So Della did the only thing she could think to do. She kept Sam alive for the child in the one way that mattered most. She taught Maisie to be like him. Look for the people who are struggling, she would tell her daughter, brushing her hair before school. And if you can help them, even a little, you help them. That is what your daddy did. That is the best of what a person can be. And Maisie, 6 years old and solemn about it, would nod and take it into her heart, the way children take in the things that matter. To keep the 2 of them afloat, Della worked herself to the bone. In the mornings and afternoons she waited tables at a small diner downtown, a warm, greasy, friendly place run by a gruff old man named Gus who had a soft spot for her, and slipped extra food into her takeaway box when he thought she was not looking. And in the evenings, and on the days the diner did not need her, she cleaned houses, the big fine houses up on the hill, scrubbing other people's floors and polishing other people's silver, and going home to her own small cold house at the end of it, too tired most nights to do more than kiss her sleeping daughter and fall into bed. It was a hard life. I will not pretend to you that it was not. Money was a constant, gnawing worry, the kind that sits at the bottom of your stomach and never quite goes away. And in the weeks before this story truly begins, that worry had grown into something sharper. Because the landlord had raised the rent again, and Della had done the arithmetic at her kitchen table late one night, the way the poor do their terrible arithmetic, adding and subtracting the same small numbers over and over, hoping they would come out different, and they never did. She was falling behind, and if she fell too far behind, she would lose the little house, and she did not know, truly did not know, what she and Maisie would do then. And yet, and this, my friends, is the thing you must understand about Della Monroe, the thing that makes this whole story what it is. Through all of it, through the grief and the exhaustion and the gnawing fear, Della never once lost the thing that made her who she was. She never stopped being kind. She never stopped running toward the people who were struggling, even when she herself was struggling worse than almost anyone she helped. It would have been so easy, so understandable to close up, to pull what little she had in tight around herself and her daughter, and let the rest of the cold world fend for itself. Nobody would have blamed her. But that was not who Sam had been, and it was not who Della was going to let herself become, no matter how hard the world pushed. So she was the one at the diner who quietly paid for the coffee of the old man who came in from the cold and counted out his coins and came up short. She was the one who kept a box of granola bars in her cleaning bag to hand to the people sleeping in the doorway she passed on her long walks home, because she could not bear to walk by a hungry person with food in her bag. She was the one who noticed the new girl at the diner crying in the back and sat with her on her own unpaid break. She gave and she gave and she gave out of a cup that was very nearly empty itself, and if you had asked her why, she would have looked at you as though you had asked her why she breathed. Because they needed it, she would have said. Because I could. Because somewhere out there, when my Sam ran into that building, somebody's child got to keep their father one more day. You pay that back into the world however you can. You do not get to choose to be kind only when it is easy. That is not kindness. That is just convenience. Let me give you just one memory of Sam so that you can hold him in your mind the way Della held him in her heart, because a man like that deserves to be seen, even in a story that is not mainly about him. Della used to tell it to Maisie at bedtime on the hard nights. It was the story of how they met. Della had been 22, working a checkout counter at a grocery store, and it had been a bitter winter evening, and an old man ahead of her line had come up short at the register, badly short, standing there in his thin coat counting the same few coins over and over with shaking hands, growing more ashamed by the second while the line behind him grew impatient. And a big young man near the back of the line had simply stepped forward, quietly, and paid the difference, and then, seeing the old man's thin coat, had walked him out to make sure he got to the bus safely. He had not made a show of it. He had not wanted thanks. He had just seen someone struggling and could not help. And Della, watching from behind her register, had thought, I am going to marry that man. And she had. That was Sam Monroe, all the way to the bottom of him, years before he ever ran into his last fire. He was a man who paid the difference. He was a man who walked strangers to the bus. And when Della knelt down in the rain for Eleanor Ashcroft all those years later, she was in a way still married to him, still living out the vow they had made, still paying the difference for the people the world had come up short on. And I want to show you what that looked like in Della's own life in those hard years, because it is easy to say a person is kind and harder to see it, and the seeing is what matters. There was a regular at Gus's diner, an old man named Walter, who came in most mornings for a single cup of coffee and sat by the window for as long as Gus would let him, because his apartment was cold and lonely and the diner was warm. And Walter some mornings came up short, the way the old man in the grocery store had come up short, counting his coins with shaking hands. And every single time, without a word, without ever letting him see, Della quietly paid the difference out of her own thin tips, and told Walter his coffee was on the house that day because he was her favorite customer, and refilled his cup one extra time, and sat with him a minute when the diner was slow, and asked after his late wife by name, because she had learned it, because to Della every lonely old man was somebody's whole world once. Gus knew she did it. He pretended not to. And sometimes, When Della was not looking, Gus would slip a few extra dollars into her tip jar to cover what he knew she had given away, and neither of them ever spoke of it. And that is its own small beautiful story about how kindness moves quietly through a poor and tired world, from hand to hand, when no one is watching. Della Monroe gave away what she did not have, to people who could never repay her, morning after morning, year after year, and she thought nothing of it at all. She was not keeping score. The kind ones never are. She did not know, of course, that she was planting seeds. That is the thing about the truly kind ones, my friends. They never think of it as planting. They are not keeping a ledger waiting for a return. They give because giving is simply who they are, the way a pumpkin vine puts out fruit, not because it expects thanks but because that is what a pumpkin vine was made to do. Della Monroe had been quietly planting seeds of kindness all through the coldest years of her life, in soil so poor and so frozen that it seemed like nothing could ever grow there. She had no idea that one of those seeds, planted on one particular cold and rainy night, in the unlikeliest soil of all, was about to grow into a harvest that would change everything. She was simply about to do what she always did. She was about to be the one who stopped. It was a cold night in late autumn, the kind of night when the rain comes down thin and steady and gets into everything. And Della was walking home from a late cleaning job on the hill, too short on money that week even for the bus, her thin coat pulled tight around her and her head down against the wet. It was well past 9 o'clock. The streets on the edge of downtown were nearly empty. Just the hiss of tires on wet pavement and the yellow smear of the streetlights in the rain. And Della was thinking as she walked about the arithmetic that would not come out right, about the rent, about whether she could pick up an extra shift, about the small tired face of her daughter asleep at the neighbor's until she got home. She was so deep in that familiar worry that she almost walked right past the old woman. Almost. She was slumped against the wall of a shuttered building, half in the shadow between two streetlights, a small heap of a person that most eyes would have slid right over. Her clothes were torn and filthy and soaked through, plastered to her thin frame. Her gray hair was matted and wild around a face streaked with dirt and, Della saw as she slowed, with something darker. There was a wound at the woman's temple, an ugly gash crusted with dried and fresh blood, and another on her hands, which were scraped raw as though she had fallen hard on the pavement. She was shivering so violently that Della could see it from 10 feet away. And her eyes, when Della came closer, were open, but they were not quite focused, not quite present, roaming and confused, the eyes of a person who does not entirely know where she is or how she came to be there. She looked, in every possible way, like exactly the kind of person the world has trained us all to hurry past. A homeless woman. A drunk. Someone else's tragedy. Someone not to get involved with. And here is the thing that Della noticed, standing there in the rain, the thing that turned her stomach. She was not the first person to come down that street. There were others, here and there, hurrying home under umbrellas. And Della watched. In the space of just a minute or two, 3 separate people walk right past that shivering, bleeding old woman without so much as slowing down. One of them, a well-dressed man, actually stepped out into the wet street to give the old woman a wider berth, his face wrinkling with distaste, as though her suffering were something that might rub off on his good coat. And Della understood in that moment exactly what was happening. The whole world had looked at this broken old person, and had judged her by the plainness and the poverty of her ruined skin, and had decided there was nothing there worth stopping for. They had passed the pumpkin by, reaching for something shinier. Not one of them had thought to wonder what might be inside. Della did not think about any of that, not consciously, not in the moment. She did not weigh it or calculate it or wonder what it might cost her. She simply did the thing she had always done, the thing Sam would have done, the thing that was as natural to her as breathing. She stopped. She knelt down on the cold, wet pavement beside the old woman, and she spoke to her gently, the way you speak to a frightened animal. Hey there. It's all right. I'm here. Can you hear me? The old woman's roaming eyes found Della's face, and something in them seemed to catch, to steady, just a little, as though after a long time in the dark she had finally found a single point of light to fix on. Her cracked lips moved, but what came out was faint and confused. A few broken words that did not quite make sense, something about a car, something about needing to get home, a name that Della could not make out. She was shaking so hard her teeth were chattering. She was freezing. She was hurt. And she was, Della realized with a cold clarity, in real danger, the kind of danger that a night like this one could very easily turn fatal for a frail old body. There was a man passing just then, and Della called out to him. "Please," she said, "can you help me? This woman is hurt. Can you call for an ambulance?" And the man barely broke stride. "She's probably just drunk, lady," he said over his shoulder. "Don't get yourself mixed up in that." And he was gone. And Della knelt there in the rain and understood that no one was coming. That if help was going to come to this old woman tonight, it was going to have to come from her. From a tired widow with empty pockets and an empty cupboard and nothing left to give but the one thing she never ran out of. So she gave it. She took off her own thin coat, the only coat she had, and she wrapped it around the old woman's shaking shoulders, and she pulled her gently up out of the wet, getting an arm around her, feeling how light she was, how frail, bird-like bones under soaked and filthy clothes. "You are safe now," Della told her, and she meant it with everything in her. "I have got you. We are going to get you warm." The old woman clutched at Della's arm with her scraped and bleeding hands, and she looked up into the young woman's face with those confused and frightened eyes, and she whispered in a cracked voice, "Why? Why are you helping me?" And Della, hauling the old woman carefully to her feet, gave the only answer she had, the answer that was the whole of who she was. "Because you needed someone to," she said simply. "And I'm someone." Della thought first of the hospital, of course she did. But the nearest one was far, and she had no car, and no money for a taxi, and the old woman, when Della said the word hospital, became suddenly and surprisingly agitated, shaking her head, gripping Della's arm harder, saying, "No, no, no, hospital, please," with a fear so real and so raw that Della could not bring herself to force it. Later Della would understand that fear. But in the moment, she only knew that this frightened, freezing, injured old soul was clinging to her in the rain, terrified, and that there was nowhere else, and no one else, and no time to stand in the cold debating it. Her little rented house was only a few streets away. It was small and it was cold and there was hardly any food in it. But it was warm and it was dry and it was safe, and it had a good soul in it who would not let a hurting stranger freeze to death in the dark. And so Della Monroe made the decision that would change her entire life, and she made it without any idea that it was anything more than what a decent person does. I want you to picture that walk, my friends, because it was not an easy or a graceful thing, the way kindness never really is when it costs you something. Della was not a large woman, and she was tired down to her bones from a full day's work, and the rain was cold and steady, and the old woman, though light, could barely stand, and leaned her whole weight on Della's shoulder. They went a few steps at a time and then rested and then a few more. Della's own thin blouse, without her coat now, was soaked through and freezing against her skin, because she had given her coat away, and she shivered nearly as hard as the old woman did. Her arms ached. Her feet, in their worn shoes, were numb. And more than once, on that long slow walk through the dark and empty streets, some small sensible voice in the back of Della's mind whispered the same thing Ruby would say to her later. The same thing the whole world always whispers to the kind. "This is too much. You cannot afford this. You have nothing left to give. Put her down. Someone else will come." But no one else had come. That was the whole truth of it, standing there in the rain. Della had watched 3 people walk past already. She knew with a cold certainty that if she put this old woman down and walked away, there would very likely be no one else, and that a frail old body left in the freezing wet through a night like this one might simply not be there in the morning. And so every time the sensible voice whispered "put her down," Della thought of Sam. She thought of her husband standing at the door of a burning building with a child still on the 4th floor, and every sensible voice in the world screaming at him to stay out, and Sam going in anyway, because someone needed someone and he was someone. And Della would tighten her grip and take another few steps, and whisper to the old woman, "We're almost there, stay with me just a little farther." She was not going to be the person who put someone down. She had married a man who ran into fires. She was not going to set down a freezing stranger 3 streets from a warm bed because her arms were tired. Halfway home, a car slowed beside them, and a window came down, and for one hopeful moment Della thought help had come at last. But it was only a man who looked them over, the soaked young woman and the ruined old one, and said warily, "Everything all right here?" And Della said, "Please, can you help me get her somewhere warm?" And the man's face closed and he said, "Sorry, don't want to get involved." And the window went up and the car drove on, its red lights disappearing into the rain. And Della stood there for a moment, holding the weight of a stranger, watching the tail lights vanish, and she felt the full loneliness of being the only one who stopped. It is a lonely thing, my friends, to be the kind one in an unkind moment. The whole world drives on, and you are left holding the weight, cold and tired and alone with it. But that loneliness is also the exact place where all the real goodness in this world gets done, by the ones who keep holding the weight after everyone else has driven on. Della kept holding it. She got the old woman the last 2 streets, and up her own path and through her own door out of the rain at last. And if she had known, in that freezing exhausted moment, that she was carrying a fortune's worth of gratitude over her own threshold, it would not have made her carry it one bit more gently, or one bit more gladly, than she already did. She half carried that ruined old woman the long way home through the rain, whispering to her the whole way, "You're all right, we're almost there, just a little farther, I've got you, I've got you." She took a billionaire home to her tiny freezing house, and she did not know it, and it would not have changed one single thing she did if she had. That first night, Della did what she could with what she had. She got the old woman out of the freezing wet clothes and into the warmest, softest things Della owned, an old flannel nightgown and thick wool socks. She heated water on the stove and cleaned the wound at the woman's temple as gently as she knew how, and the scrapes on her hands, and she found in her small first aid box the bandages she kept for Maisie's scraped knees, and she bound the wounds carefully. She made a pot of the thin soup that was most of what was in the cupboard that week, and she fed it to the old woman a spoonful at a time, because the woman's own hands were shaking too badly to hold the spoon. And then she gave up her own bed, the only real bed in the house, and settled the old woman into it under every blanket they owned. And Della sat up in a chair beside her through most of that first night, watching her breathe, getting up to add another blanket, to check the wound, to lay a cool cloth on her forehead when the fever came. Maisie, when she came home from the neighbors and found a strange old woman in her mother's bed, did not ask the questions another child might have asked. She simply looked up at her mother, and Della said quietly she was hurt, baby, and no one else would stop. And Maisie nodded, 6 years old and solemn, and she went and got her own most precious stuffed rabbit, the one she could not sleep without, and she tucked it gently under the old woman's arm. Because that is what her daddy would have done. That first night was long and Della did not sleep, and I think it is worth sitting in it with her for a moment, because it is in the long unglamorous hours that kindness is really made. It is easy to feel kind for the length of a single grand gesture. It is much harder to stay kind at 3 in the morning, exhausted, frightened, when the fever climbs and the stranger in your bed cries out in confusion and does not know you, and you have work in a few hours and no money and no idea what you have taken on. That is where Della lived that first night, and every hour of it, and she did not waver. When Eleanor woke disoriented and afraid, Della was there, her voice low and steady. "You are safe, you had a fall, you are with friends now, rest." When the fever spiked, Della wrung out cloths and cool water and laid them on the old woman's brow, over and over, through the small dark hours. When Eleanor's hands shook too badly to hold water, Della held the cup to her cracked lips, patient as anything, a sip at a time. She did the humble, endless, unwitnessed work of caring for a helpless stranger through the worst of a night, the work no one would ever thank her for, the work she did not do for thanks. And somewhere in those dark hours, watching over the frightened breathing of a woman whose name she barely knew, Della felt, for the first time in 3 years, not quite so alone in her own grief. There is a strange mercy in caring for someone more broken than you are. It reminds you that you still have something to give, that the world still needs your hands, that you are not, after all, only a widow drowning in arithmetic, but a person with a warm bed and a strong back and a good heart, and the power to stand between one suffering soul and the cold. Della had forgotten she had that power. The old woman in the rain had reminded her. And so even that first terrible sleepless night was, in its own quiet way, already a gift passing in both directions, though neither of them could have said so yet, because that is what her daddy would have done. For the first 2 days, the old woman drifted in and out, feverish and confused. She would wake and not know where she was, and Della would be there, calm and steady, telling her, "You are safe, you had a bad fall, you are with friends now, rest." Slowly, as the fever broke and the warmth and the food did their patient work, The confusion began to lift, and the woman came back to herself, a little more each day. She told them on the third day that her name was Eleanor. She could not or would not tell them much more than that, not at first. Her memory of how she had come to be on that street was full of holes, fragments that did not connect, something about feeling suddenly ill, and dizzy and frightened in a car, and then walking and being unable to find her way, and then the cold, and then falling, and then the dark, until a young woman had knelt down in the rain and told her she was safe. She would grow agitated and upset when she tried to push at those holes in her memory, and so Della, wise and gentle, stopped pushing. "It does not matter right now," she would say, smoothing the old woman's hair. "Right now you just get strong. The rest will come when it comes." There were hints if Della had been the sort of person to go looking for them, but she was not, and that is exactly the point. As the fog lifted from Eleanor's mind, little things surfaced that did not quite fit the picture of a lost old woman off the street. Her speech, when it steadied, was precise and cultured, the speech of someone long accustomed to being listened to. Once, half asleep, she murmured something about a board meeting, and that they must not proceed without her. Another time she woke with a start and said, quite clearly, "Tell Foster to bring the car around," before the confusion took her again. She held her teacup a particular way. She said please and thank you to Della with a graciousness that had the polish of a whole different world in it. And there was the ring, of course, the fine old ring with the large clear stone that Della had assumed was costume glass, catching the lamplight on the old woman's thin finger. Any person inclined to wonder what they might get out of this would have added those small clues together, and started asking careful questions, started calculating, started treating the guest a little differently. Della noticed none of it, or rather she noticed and thought nothing of it, because she was simply not built to look at a hurting person and see an opportunity. When Eleanor said please and thank you like a duchess, Della thought only, someone raised her right. When Eleanor murmured about a board meeting, Della thought only, she is dreaming about her old work, the poor thing, and tucked the blanket tighter. When Eleanor said the name Foster, Della thought only, someone she loves, someone she has lost track of, and it made her want to help the old woman find her way home all the more. Della did not connect the fine speech and the giving ring and the talk of cars and boards into a picture of wealth, because wealth was not what Della was looking at. She was looking at a frightened old woman who needed her, and everything else was just detail. And I want you to sit with that, my friends, because it is the very thing that made Della worthy of what was coming. A lesser person would have seen the ring and started to hope. Della saw the fear and started to help. The whole difference between a person who gets a reward and a person who deserves one lives in that single distinction. Eleanor, even in her confusion, was watching Della fail to notice the ring, and something in the old woman, some part of her that had been lied to and flattered and used for 80 years, was quietly, astonished, beginning to trust. "It does not matter," Eleanor said to her one evening, testing something, her eyes sharper than they had been. "If I turned out to be someone important, Della, someone with money, would that change how you are with me?" And Della, wringing out a cloth, laughed a little tiredly, not understanding it was a real question. "It'd change whether I let you help with the dishes," she said. "Rich or poor, you're not lifting a finger until that head of yours is healed. Now lean back." And Eleanor Ashcroft leaned back against the pillows, and looked at the ceiling of that little house, and felt her old eyes sting, because she had just been given the truest answer she had ever received to the question that had haunted her whole life, and the young woman who gave it had not even known she was answering it. And here, my friends, is the thing I most want you to see about those quiet days, because it is the very heart of this whole story. In all that time, through all that care, Della Monroe never once, not for a single moment, thought about what she might get out of it. It never entered her mind. She did not go through the old woman's ruined clothes looking for a wallet, for money, for anything. She did not ask Eleanor whether she had family who might pay for her trouble. She noticed once that the old woman still wore a ring, a fine old ring with a large clear stone, but Della simply assumed it was costume jewelry, a pretty piece of glass an old woman was fond of, and she thought no more about it except to keep it safe. It genuinely, honestly never occurred to Della that there might be a reward at the end of this. She was not caring for Eleanor as an investment. She was caring for her because Eleanor was a hurting human being who had needed someone to stop, and Della was someone. That was all. That was everything. And it was precisely because Della wanted nothing that what she was about to receive would mean so very much. What grew instead in those days was something far more valuable than any reward, though none of them knew yet how valuable. What grew was love. Because two lonely, grieving souls had been brought under one small roof, and they had begun, without meaning to fill the empty places in each other. Eleanor, it would turn out, was as alone in the world as Della was in her own way, a truth that all her money had never been able to fix. And Della had a great warm heart with a husband-shaped hole in the middle of it. And little Maisie, who had never known a grandmother, took to the old woman with the whole fierce sudden love of a child. She would sit on the edge of the bed and tell Eleanor long serious stories about her stuffed rabbit and her days at school, and Eleanor, who was not used to being talked to as though she were simply a person, as though she were somebody's grandmother, would listen to every word with a wondering softness on her face, and something in her that had been frozen for a very long time began, quietly to thaw. Della would come home from a double shift, aching and exhausted, and find the two of them there, the old woman and the little girl, heads bent together over a picture book, and something in her tired chest would lift, just for a moment, at the sight of it. There was one evening in those early days that Della would remember for the rest of her life. She had come home late and bone-tired from a double shift, and she had stopped in the doorway, and there in the lamplight was Eleanor, sitting up in the bed, with Maisie curled against her side, and the old woman was teaching the little girl a card game with an ancient, worn deck she had asked Della to find in a drawer. And Maisie was laughing, that pure bright laugh she had inherited from her father, and Eleanor was laughing too, a rusty, surprised sort of laugh, as though her body had forgotten how and was only just remembering. And Della stood in the doorway unseen, and watched the ruined old stranger she had carried home in the rain teaching her fatherless daughter to laugh, and she felt something she had not felt in 3 years. She felt like her family had grown instead of shrunk. She did not understand it then. She only knew that this frail old woman, who by every measure was a burden Della could not afford, had somehow quietly become a gift. Later that night, when Maisie was asleep, Eleanor caught Della's hand as she tucked the blankets in, and she said in a voice thick with something she could not quite name, "I have not laughed like that in a very long time, my dear. I had forgotten I could." "Thank you." And Della, who thought she was the one giving all the care, understood, just for a moment, that she was receiving something too, though she could not yet have said what. But not everyone understood what Della was doing, and I would be lying to you if I said no one tried to talk her out of it. Her neighbor, a good-hearted but practical woman named Ruby who helped watch Maisie, came by one afternoon and found the old stranger still there, a week in, and she pulled Della aside into the kitchen and spoke to her low and urgent. "Della, honey," she said, "you cannot afford this. Look at you. You are skin and bones, you are giving that woman your own food, I have seen it. You do not even know who she is. She could be sick in the head, she could have people looking for her who will blame you, she could be anything. You have a little girl to think about. Call the county. Let them take her to a shelter, to a hospital, somewhere that is their job and not yours. You have done more than enough. No one would think less of you." And it was not cruel what Ruby said. It was sensible. It was, by every hard measure of Della's hard life, exactly correct. Della could not afford this. She did not know who Eleanor was. She had every reason in the world to hand the burden to someone else, and go back to the impossible work of simply keeping herself and her daughter alive. And Della listened to all of it, and she was quiet for a while, drying a dish. And then she said the thing that was the whole of who she was. "Ruby," she said, "when Sam ran into that building, the sensible thing was to stay out. Everybody who ever loved him would have understood if he had stayed out. He had a wife. He had a little girl. Nobody would have thought less of him." She set down the dish. "But he went in. Because there was a person in there who needed someone to come, and he was someone. And I cannot teach my daughter that her daddy was a hero for running toward people, and then turn around and shove a hurting old woman out my door the minute it costs me something. What kind of lesson is that? What kind of person does that make me?" She shook her head. "I do not know who she is, Ruby, but I know she is somebody's Eleanor. I know she was cold and hurt and alone and everyone walked past her but me. And I am not going to be one more person who walks past. I would rather go hungry." And Ruby, looking at her tired, stubborn, luminous friend, understood that there was no talking her out of it, and that this was, in fact, exactly why she loved her. And she stopped trying and she started, quietly, bringing over a little extra food herself. Because that is how it works, my friends. One stubborn act of kindness, held to in the face of all good sense, has a way of pulling more kindness in around it, like a low warm fire on a cold night. It was not easy. I do not want you to imagine that it was easy. Della was already stretched to breaking before she took in a third mouth to feed. And now the small food went even less far. And Della quietly went without so that Eleanor and Maisie could eat, telling them she had eaten at the diner when she had not. She picked up every extra shift she could get, and she fell further behind on the rent, and the fear that lived at the bottom of her stomach grew sharper and colder. There was a night, near the end of the first week, when Della sat at her kitchen table after the others were asleep, with the bills spread out in front of her, and the terrible arithmetic refusing once again to come out right, and she put her tired face in her hands, just for a moment, and let herself be afraid. And she thought, perhaps for one weak and human moment, that she should not have taken this on, that she could not afford to be this kind, that the world had finally asked more of her than she had to give. And then she heard a small sound and looked up, and there in the doorway was Eleanor, leaning on the frame, having gotten herself out of bed for the first time on her own 2 feet. And the old woman looked at the young one, at the bills, at the tears the young woman was too proud to let fall, and something passed across Eleanor's face, something that Della was far too tired to read. It was recognition. It was resolve. It was the beginning of a decision. "You are a good woman, Della Monroe," Eleanor said quietly, in a voice that was stronger than it had been and clearer, a voice that carried, though Della did not notice it then, the unmistakable ring of someone long accustomed to being listened to. "A better woman than the whole world deserves." And Della, wiping her eyes, managed a tired smile and said, "Oh, I don't know about that. Go on back to bed now, Eleanor, you'll catch cold." And she got up and she helped the old woman back to bed and she tucked her in, and she had no idea, none at all, that she had just been seen completely by exactly the person in all the world most able to change her life. Now, while all of this was happening in that small warm house at the edge of town, let me tell you what was happening on the other side of the city, in a world so different that it might as well have been another planet. Because the old woman asleep in Della Monroe's bed, the ruined stranger everyone had stepped around in the rain, was not, in fact, a homeless woman or a drunk or anyone's forgotten tragedy. Her name was Eleanor Ashcroft, and she was the founder, the chairwoman, and the majority owner of Ashcroft Holdings, a company she had built with her late husband from a single small shop into one of the largest privately held fortunes in the entire country. Eleanor Ashcroft was, by any measure the world uses, one of the wealthiest people alive. And for 11 days now, she had been missing, and the people who ran her empire had been quietly, frantically, and very selectively looking for her. Here is how it had happened. Eleanor, you must understand, was not a well woman, though she had hidden it, in the fierce and proud way of people who have spent their whole lives being strong. Her heart had been troubling her for some time, and more than her heart there had been episodes lately, spells of confusion and dizziness that frightened her more than she would ever admit, moments when the world went strange and unfamiliar, and she could not quite hold on to where she was. Her doctor suspected the beginnings of a condition, something in the blood vessels of the brain, small strokes perhaps, the kind of thing that comes for the old and steals them away by inches. She had told almost no one. And 11 days before, she had insisted, against everyone's advice, on going out alone. She had wanted, she said, to visit the grave of her husband Julian, who had died 2 years before and whom she missed with an ache that all her billions could not touch. She had slipped away from her staff, driven herself, which she was no longer really fit to do. And somewhere on that drive, out past the edges of the parts of the city she knew, one of those spells had come over her. There had been a small accident, her car clipping another and coming to rest against a curb, and in her confusion and her fear and her shame she had done a terrible, disoriented thing. She had gotten out and she had walked away from the wreck, and she had kept walking, deeper and deeper into a part of the city she did not know. Her phone left behind in the car, her fine clothes slowly ruined by rain and falls, her sharp and famous mind clouded and lost, until she was just another anonymous old woman on a dark street, indistinguishable from any other, waiting for someone to stop. Back in the gleaming tower where Ashcroft Holdings had its offices, her disappearance had thrown everything into quiet chaos. And it is here, my friends, that you begin to see the difference between the people who loved Eleanor and the people who merely wanted what she had. Because a crisis has a way of showing you exactly what is inside each person. The way splitting a pumpkin shows you what has really been growing under the skin. There was her granddaughter, Claire Ashcroft, a young woman of 28, and Claire was frantic. Claire loved her grandmother with her whole heart, not for her money but for herself, for the fierce, funny, brilliant woman who had raised her after Claire's own parents died young. Claire had not slept properly in 11 days. She had personally walked the streets near where the abandoned car had been found. She had put up flyers. She had begged the police to do more. She did not care about the company or the fortune or any of it. She wanted her grandmother back. Let me tell you why Claire loved Eleanor the way she did, because it matters. Claire's own parents, Eleanor's son and daughter-in-law, had died in an accident when Claire was only 9 years old, and it was Eleanor, then already an old woman and the head of a vast company, who had taken the grieving child in and raised her herself, not with nannies and boarding schools, though she could have afforded 1,000 of them, but with her own 2 hands, as much as her work would allow. Eleanor had read to her at night. Eleanor had shown up at her school plays, slipping into the back after boardroom battles, still in her fierce dark suits, to watch her granddaughter be a tree or a snowflake. Eleanor had taught her that money was a tool and never a purpose, that the measure of a person was what they did for those who could do nothing for them. Claire did not love her grandmother because Eleanor was rich. Claire loved her grandmother because when the whole world had fallen out from under a 9-year-old girl, one fierce old woman had reached down and caught her. And now that old woman was lost somewhere in the cold, frightened and alone, and Claire was 9 years old again inside, falling with no one reaching down to catch her. In those 11 days, Claire barely ate and barely slept. She drove the streets herself for hours every night, slowing the car at every huddled figure in every doorway, rolling down the window into the cold to peer at faces that were never the right one. She printed flyers with her grandmother's photograph and taped them to lampposts with her own hands in the rain, her fingers going numb. She went to the police again and again and was told gently that a competent adult who leaves is not technically a missing person, and that there were procedures and that these things took time. And she wanted to scream at them that her grandmother was not competent right now, that she was sick and lost and did not know her own name, that every hour mattered. She sat up at night in her grandmother's empty house, in the room where Eleanor had read to her as a child, holding one of the old woman's cardigans just to smell her, and she prayed, though she was not sure she believed in anything, to please let someone be kind to her. Let someone out there be kind to her. She did not know, praying that desperate prayer into the dark, that a poor widow at the edge of the city had already answered it. She did not know that her grandmother was, at that very moment, warm and safe and being fed soup one careful spoonful at a time by exactly the kind of person Claire was begging the universe to send. The kindness had already been given. It would simply take 11 days for the knowing of it to travel home. And then there was Roland Kessler. Roland was Eleanor's nephew by marriage, and more to the point, he was the chief operating officer of Ashcroft Holdings, an ambitious, polished, cold-eyed man who had spent years positioning himself close to the center of the company's power. And Roland's response to Eleanor's disappearance told you everything you needed to know about him. He had not walked a single street. He had not put up a single flyer. What Roland had done in those 11 days was work quietly and relentlessly to consolidate his own control. He had leaned on the family lawyers about the process of declaring Eleanor legally incapacitated. He had made careful calls to certain members of the board. He had insisted, above all, that her disappearance be kept absolutely secret from the press and the markets, ostensibly to protect the company's stock price, but truly, Claire suspected because a missing chairwoman who might be dead somewhere was, for a man like Roland, less a tragedy than an opportunity. He wanted the company. He had always wanted the company. And a lost, confused, vanished old woman was, to him, simply the last obstacle between himself and everything he had ever coveted. He was searching, yes. But he was not searching for Eleanor. He was searching for control of what Eleanor owned. There is all the difference in the world between those two things, and before this story is over, Eleanor Ashcroft is going to see that difference with perfect, terrible clarity. There was one more person searching, and he is the one who mattered most in the end. His name was Foster, and he had been Eleanor's driver and the head of her personal security for over 20 years, and he loved the old woman with the quiet, unshakable loyalty of a man who had spent 2 decades keeping her safe and had failed, this once, to do it. Foster did not care about the board, or the stock price, or Roland's maneuvering. Foster cared about one thing only, which was finding the woman he had sworn to protect. And while Roland worked the phones in his corner office, Foster worked the streets. He went personally to every hospital, every shelter, every police precinct in the part of the city where the car had been found. He showed Eleanor's photograph to everyone who would look. And it was Foster, in the end, patient and dogged and refusing to give up, who found the first true thread. Because Della, you see, good and responsible as she was, had not simply kept Eleanor hidden away. In that first week, worried about the old woman's memory and her wounds, Della had gone to the small local clinic near her house and described the situation to a nurse she trusted, asking quietly whether anyone had reported an old woman missing, whether there was a family somewhere frantic for her. She had left her name and her address in case. She had done exactly the right thing, the honest thing, the thing a person hoping for a reward would never have done, because a person hoping for a reward keeps the golden goose hidden. Della was trying to give Eleanor back. And that quiet, honest inquiry at a neighborhood clinic was the thread that Foster, going door to door, clinic to clinic, finally pulled. A nurse remembered. There was a young woman, she said. Kind. Worried. She took in an injured old lady off the street. Left her address in case anyone came looking. And Foster's heart began to pound, and he wrote down the address of a tiny rented house at the edge of town, and he made 2 phone calls. The first was to Claire. The second, because protocol demanded it, was to Roland. And so it was that on a gray afternoon a long black car, and behind it a second one, came easing down a narrow street where such cars never came, and rolled to a stop in front of Della Monroe's little house, and the two worlds, the one of almost nothing and the one of almost everything, finally came together at her door. Della was at home that afternoon, which was itself a small mercy, doing the laundry by hand in the kitchen sink while Eleanor, much stronger now, sat at the table drying dishes and Maisie played on the floor. When the knock came at the door, firm and unfamiliar, Della wiped her hands and opened it, and found herself looking at a large, grave man in a dark suit, and behind him, hurrying up the path, a young woman with tears already starting in her eyes, and behind her, stepping out of the second car and buttoning his fine coat with an expression of cool distaste as he surveyed the humble little house, a polished man who looked at everything and everyone as though calculating its price. Foster, the security man, looked past Della into the house, and his weathered face, which had not broken in 11 days of fear, suddenly cracked wide open. Because there, at the kitchen table, in a borrowed flannel nightgown, holding a dish towel, was the woman he had sworn to protect and had searched for without sleep for 11 days. Mrs. Ashcroft, he said, and his voice broke on it. What happened next happened very fast, and Della, standing in the middle of it, understood almost none of it at first. The young woman, Claire, pushed past her with a sob and flew across the little kitchen and fell to her knees beside the old woman's chair, wrapping her arms around her, saying "Grandmother, grandmother," over and over into her shoulder, and the old woman, Della's Eleanor, held the girl and stroked her hair and said, "There now, Claire, there now, I am all right, I am all right." And Della saw the old woman's own eyes fill. And Della stood there with her wet hands and her worn nightgown, watching this reunion unfold in her tiny kitchen, and she began, slowly, to understand that the frail lost stranger she had carried home in the rain was somebody's whole world, was a person whose disappearance had torn a hole in other lives just as real as the one in her own. And then the polished man in the fine coat spoke, and his voice was cold, and it turned the whole warm moment to ice. "Well," he said, looking around the shabby little house with his lip faintly curled, "isn't this a touching scene? And how much exactly is this going to cost us?" Della blinked at him, not understanding. The man, Roland, looked at her the way the man in the rain had stepped around Eleanor, as though she were something distasteful, something to be managed. Let me guess, Roland went on, his voice smooth and poisonous. You found a confused, wealthy old woman wandering the streets. You recognized an opportunity and you have been holding her here, in this, he gestured around the room, this place, keeping her from her family, running up a nice little bill of gratitude in your head, waiting for exactly this moment. How much do you want, miss? Name your number. We have lawyers who are very good at making people like you disappear, but we can also, he smiled thinly, be generous if you are quiet and quick about it. Della felt the blood drain from her face. She opened her mouth and no words came out, because the accusation was so ugly, so completely upside down from the truth, that she did not even know how to begin to answer it. She had given up her bed. She had gone hungry so this woman could eat. She had gone to the clinic to try to find this very family. And now she was being called a kidnapper, a grifter, a vulture in her own kitchen in front of her child. But before Della could find her voice, before the shame and the shock could even fully land, another voice cut through the room like a blade, and it was not weak and it was not confused, and it was not the voice of a frail lost old woman at all. It was the voice of Eleanor Ashcroft, chairwoman of Ashcroft Holdings, the voice that had commanded boardrooms for 50 years, and it stopped Roland Kessler where he stood. Roland! The old woman had risen from her chair, one hand on Claire's shoulder, and she had drawn herself up to her full height, and though she wore a borrowed nightgown and wool socks, there was suddenly no mistaking who she was. You will not, she said, each word falling like a stone, say one more word to this woman. Not one. Roland's smooth face faltered. Aunt Eleanor, I only meant to protect you from, no, Eleanor said. You meant to protect the company from a scandal, and yourself from an expense, and I have watched you do it for 11 days from a distance you did not know I could see. She looked at him and there was something terrible and clear in her eyes now, the look of a woman who has been given, by illness and by accident, the rare and awful gift of seeing exactly who everyone around her truly is. I want you to listen to me very carefully, Roland, she said, and I want everyone in this room to hear it. This woman did not kidnap me. This woman saved my life. And Della, standing frozen by her sink, felt the whole world tilt on its axis. Eleanor turned then away from Roland and she looked at Della, and all the steel went out of her face, and what was left was something soft and grateful and very close to breaking. I was on the ground in the rain, Eleanor said, quietly now, speaking to the whole room but looking only at Della. Hurt and lost and out of my mind with confusion, and I could not tell anyone who I was or where I belonged. And do you know how many people walked past me that night? Do you know how many well-dressed, comfortable people looked at me and saw garbage and stepped around me and left me to die in the cold? Her voice trembled. And then this woman stopped. This woman who has almost nothing, who I have since learned goes without food so that my belly and her daughters are full, who gave up her own bed and sat awake all night cleaning my wounds. This woman knelt down in the rain and gave me her own coat and told me I was safe. She asked me for nothing. She has never once asked me for anything. She went to a clinic and tried to find you, Roland, tried to give me back to the very family that could not be bothered to walk the streets looking for me. She looked around at all of them, at Claire weeping quietly, at Foster with his head bowed, at Roland gone pale and silent. She is worth, Eleanor said, more than every person in this company put together. And I will not have her spoken to as anything less than the finest human being I have met in 80 years of a very long life. The room was utterly silent. Maisie, on the floor, had gotten up and crossed to press herself against her mother's leg, sensing the storm in the air, and Della put a trembling hand on her daughter's hair. And Eleanor Ashcroft crossed the little kitchen slowly on her recovered legs, and she took both of Della's wet, work-worn hands in her own, and she looked up into the young widow's stunned face. I am so sorry, my dear, she said, that this is how you learned who I am. I know it changes nothing about who you are. It only changes what I am now able to do. And Della, who had never in her wildest imaginings connected the frail old woman she loved with any of this, finally found her voice. And what she said told Eleanor Ashcroft more than anything else could have, exactly what kind of woman she had been rescued by. It doesn't matter who you are, Della whispered. tears finally spilling down her tired face. I didn't help Eleanor Ashcroft. I never even heard that name until just now. I helped a person who was hurt. I'd have done exactly the same if you were nobody at all. And Eleanor Ashcroft, hearing that, put her arms around the young woman and held her, and wept, because in 80 years of being surrounded by people who wanted something from her, she had finally, at the very end of her life, found one who had wanted nothing at all. That night, after the fine cars had gone and it was just the three of them again in the small house, Della moved through her evening in a kind of daze. She washed the teacups the great Eleanor Ashcroft had dried. She tucked Maisie into bed and Maisie asked, "Is Nana Eleanor going to go away now that her family found her?" And Della, who had been asking herself the very same question, said, "I don't know, baby. I think she might have to." And she felt the loss of it already sharp and surprising, because somewhere in those quiet weeks the old woman had stopped being a stranger she was caring for, and had become someone she loved, someone whose leaving would tear a fresh small hole in a heart that already had a Sam-shaped one. Della had not known she was allowed to love again. She had spent 3 years so braced against more loss that she had walled herself off from it, and this fierce funny old woman had somehow slipped right over the wall while Della was busy nursing her wounds. And now Della stood in her kitchen and understood that she was about to lose her too. Back to a world of gleaming towers where a diner waitress had no place. She sat for a long while at her kitchen table, turning the strange new knowledge over and over. Eleanor Ashcroft. The name had meant nothing to her, but she understood now, from the cars and the suits and the way that cold man had spoken of lawyers, that the woman sleeping in her spare room was wealthy beyond anything Della could imagine. And what struck Della sitting there was not what she might get from it. It was a kind of retroactive fear, a shiver at how close it had come to going differently. All those people who had walked past Eleanor in the rain. If Della had been one more of them, if she had kept her head down and hurried home the way any sensible tired person would have, this brilliant, fierce, precious old woman would have died in a gutter, anonymous and alone, and the world would never have known it had lost her. And Della thought about how many other Eleanors were out there, on how many other cold streets, ruined-looking and overlooked and worth infinitely more than anyone passing them could ever guess. And she resolved, sitting at that table, that she would go on stopping. Not for reward. She still had no thought of reward, but because she had just learned in the most vivid way possible that you never ever know what treasure is inside the plain and broken shell you are tempted to walk past. When Della finally went to check on her guest one last time before bed, Eleanor was awake, sitting up in the lamplight, and she looked at Della with an expression the young woman could not quite read. "Come here, child," she said, and patted the edge of the bed. And Della sat. "You are worried I am going to disappear back into all of that," Eleanor said, not asking. Della managed a small tired smile. "It's all right," she said. "You have people. A whole life. I'm just glad we could help you find your way back to it." And Eleanor took the young woman's work-worn hand in both of hers, and she said fiercely, "Listen to me, Della Monroe. I have been rich my whole life, and I have never once been at home anywhere the way I have been at home in this little house with you and that child. Whatever happens next, whatever I have to go back to sort out, you have not seen the last of me. Do you understand? You did not take in a stranger. You took in family. And family does not disappear." And Della, who had braced herself for goodbye, felt something ease in her chest that she had not known was clenched, and she did not entirely believe it yet, because life had taught her not to, but she would come in time to learn that Eleanor Ashcroft always kept her word. Eleanor did not leave that day. She could have. Her family was there, and her cars, and her whole gleaming world waiting to reclaim her. But she looked around that small warm house, at the child and the young widow who had taken her in, and she found that she was not ready to go, and more than that she did not want to leave the way a rescued thing leaves, hurriedly, gratefully, and forever. She stayed for tea. She sent Roland away, coldly, back to the tower, with instructions to touch nothing and decide nothing until she returned. She kept only Claire and Foster, and she sat at Della's little table, and over that pot of tea gently, she asked Della to tell her about herself. And Della, who never spoke of these things, who carried her burdens quietly and alone, found herself telling this old woman the whole of it, in a way she had not told anyone in 3 years. She told Eleanor about Sam. About the big laughing gentle man who ran toward people. About the fire and the family he carried out, and the child on the 4th floor, and the floor that came down. She told her about the folded flag and the fire helmet she could not give away, and the arithmetic that would not come out right, and the 2 jobs and the 3 jobs and the rent that climbed, and the fear that lived at the bottom of her stomach. She told her most of all about the promise she was trying to keep, the promise to raise Maisie to be like her father, to look for the people who are struggling, and to help them even when you are struggling worse yourself. And Eleanor Ashcroft listened to all of it, this woman who had built an empire, who had negotiated with presidents and prime ministers, and she wept openly without shame into her tea. Because she understood, now, the soil that Della's kindness had grown in. She understood that the young woman who had knelt down for her in the rain had not done so out of some easy comfort or surplus of good fortune. She had done it out of the very depths of her own grief and her own poverty, honoring a dead hero husband by running toward a stranger when the whole world ran away. Your husband, Eleanor said quietly when Della had finished, sounds like the finest kind of man there is. And Della said he was. And Eleanor said, and he married exactly the right woman. Because you are the finest kind of woman there is. And I think, my dear, that Sam has been looking after both of us these past 2 weeks. Because of all the people on all the streets in this city, I fell down in the rain in front of the one whose whole heart was already shaped, by love and by loss, to stop. Eleanor's own recovery, over the following weeks, was slow but steady, and the doctors, once her family finally got her properly cared for, found that the episodes could be managed far better than anyone had feared. That with the right treatment she had good years ahead of her still. But something in Eleanor had changed in that small house, changed permanently, and it was not the illness that had changed it. It was the kindness. For 80 years, Eleanor Ashcroft had lived in a world where every hand that reached toward her wanted something, where every kindness had a price tag she could sense even when it was hidden, where she had grown so accustomed to being a fortune with a person attached that she had half forgotten she was a person at all. And then a woman who did not know her name and wanted nothing from her had knelt in the rain and called her safe. It had cracked something open in the old woman, split her plain hard-weathered shell right down the middle, and revealed inside all the sweetness and all the seeds that a lifetime in that cold world had kept locked away. Eleanor Ashcroft had been given, at the very end of her life, the one thing all her money had never been able to buy. She had been loved as a person for nothing by someone who expected nothing. And she was not going to waste it. Now, when a very wealthy person decides to help a poor one, my friends, there is a right way and a wrong way to do it, and the difference between them is everything. The wrong way is to write a large check and hand it over and feel that the debt is paid, which turns the kind poor person into a charity case, a project, a thing that was fixed with money, and quietly takes their dignity even as it fills their pockets. Eleanor Ashcroft had spent 50 years giving money away, and she knew that wrong way intimately, and she was determined not to do it. She did not want to reward Della the way you pay a bill. She wanted to do something far more difficult and far more loving. She wanted to lift Della up in a way that honored, rather than erased, exactly who Della was. And so she did not begin with a check at all. She began by asking Della a question that no one had asked the young widow in a very long time. Not what do you need, but what do you dream of? If the fear at the bottom of your stomach were gone, Della, if you never had to do that terrible arithmetic again, what would you want to build? And Della, sitting at her own kitchen table, was so unused to being asked such a thing that she could not answer at first. She had not let herself dream in years. Dreaming was a luxury for people who could afford it. But Eleanor waited, patient as good soil, and slowly, haltingly, Della began to tell her. But before I tell you what grew from that dreaming, I have to tell you what happened back at the Gleaming Tower, because Eleanor Ashcroft had come home from that little house with something more valuable than any fortune. She had come home with clear eyes. The illness and the accident and the 11 days lost in the cold had stripped something away from her, some comfortable illusion, and the kindness of a stranger had finished the job. She could see now with a terrible and perfect clarity exactly who each person in her life truly was. She had lain helpless and anonymous on a street, worth nothing to anyone who did not know her name, and she had learned in the hardest possible way the difference between the people who loved her and the people who loved what she owned. and now she was going to act on what she had learned. She thought about the 11 days. She thought about who had walked the streets and who had worked the phones. She thought about Foster, her driver of 20 years, who had gone without sleep, hospital to hospital, shelter to shelter, showing her photograph to anyone who would look, because he could not bear that she was lost and afraid somewhere. She thought about Claire, her granddaughter, who had put up flyers with her own hands and begged the police and wept herself sick, and who had not once in 11 days mentioned the company or the money or what would happen to any of it. And then she thought about Roland. Roland, who had not walked a single street. Roland, who had spent those 11 days not searching for his missing aunt but circling her empire like a patient vulture, consulting lawyers about declaring her incompetent, counting board votes, keeping her disappearance secret not to protect her but to protect his own quiet ascent. Roland, who had walked into that little house and, before he had said one word of gratitude that his aunt was alive, had tried to buy off and threaten the woman who had saved her. Eleanor had spent years telling herself that Roland was ambitious but loyal, hard but family. She saw now that she had been telling herself a comfortable lie, the way you tell yourself the plain pretty pumpkin will surely be sweet inside, and she had finally split him open and found the rot. Eleanor called a meeting of the board of Ashcroft Holdings, her first appearance since her disappearance, and the room fell silent when she walked in, upright and clear-eyed and entirely herself. And she did not raise her voice because she had never needed to. She informed the board calmly that she was quite well, quite lucid, and quite done being underestimated. And then she turned to Roland Kessler, and in front of the entire board she laid out, precisely and without heat, everything he had done in the 11 days he believed she was lost. The lawyers he had contacted. The votes he had courted. The complete and total absence of any genuine effort to find her, as opposed to his tireless effort to inherit her. She did not shout. She simply told the truth in plain words, the way her granddaughter's kindness and a poor widow's honesty had reminded her the truth could be told. And when she was finished, she removed Roland Kessler from his position as chief operating officer, effective immediately, and from the board, and from every position of trust and authority within the company she had built. You spent 11 days, she told him quietly, as he sat white and speechless, trying to take what I had. You never once tried to find me. A young woman with nothing found me in the rain and wanted nothing. I have learned at the very end of my life, exactly what a person is worth, and it has nothing to do with what they own or covet. You are worth, Roland, precisely what you gave. Which was nothing. Now go. And Roland Kessler went, and the door closed behind him, and it was not slammed, and no one ran after him, and that was the whole of his comeuppance, which is the only kind that ever really lands. He simply reaped at last exactly what he had planted. And then Eleanor did the other half of it, the half that mattered more. She named her granddaughter Claire to a real position of responsibility within the company, not because Claire was family, but because Claire had shown in the hardest test there is that she understood the one thing Roland never would. That people matter more than property, that love is not a transaction, that you search for the person and not the fortune. Eleanor began in those weeks to teach Claire everything, to prepare her, slowly and properly, to one day carry the whole thing forward, not as a prize to be seized but as a responsibility to be honored. And Claire, who loved her grandmother and had never wanted any of it for its own sake, turned out to be exactly the steward Eleanor had spent her whole life hoping to find and had almost, but for a widow in the rain, died without finding. The empire Eleanor Ashcroft had built would not fall into the hands of a vulture. It would pass in time to a young woman with a good heart, who had proven that heart when it counted. That, too, was part of the harvest of that cold and rainy night. Della had not only saved Eleanor's life. Without ever knowing it, she had saved the soul of everything Eleanor had built, by showing the old woman just in time how to tell the difference between the people who loved her and the people who did not. Now let me tell you what grew from that dreaming back at Della's kitchen table, because Eleanor Ashcroft kept her word, and she did it the right way, the loving way, the way that lifted Della up without ever once making her small. It began with the simple, immediate things, the things that lift the fear from the bottom of a person's stomach so that they can finally stand up straight and breathe. The debt was gone, all of it, cleared away as easily as Della cleared crumbs from a table. The crushing weight of it simply lifted off her shoulders in an afternoon. The little rented house at the edge of town, the one with the frozen pipes and the complaining roof, Eleanor bought it outright and put the deed in Della's name, so that no landlord could ever again raise a rent she could not pay, so that Della and Maisie would always have a roof that was truly their own. But Eleanor did not stop there. And she did not simply move them into some fine mansion on the hill, because she understood that a home is not a house, and that ripping a person out of their whole life and depositing them in a gilded room is its own kind of loneliness. Instead, she made their own home warm and whole and safe, and she let Della keep the life she had built, and she asked her always what Della wanted, rather than deciding it for her. For Maisie, Eleanor did the thing that every struggling parent lies awake dreaming of. She secured the child's entire future. A fund was created quietly and generously that would see Maisie Monroe through the best schooling there was, all the way as far as the bright, watchful, tender-hearted little girl wanted to go, so that Sam Monroe's daughter would never have to do the terrible arithmetic her mother had done, would never have to choose between her dreams and her survival. Maisie would grow up free. And Eleanor, who had lost her own family young and raised a granddaughter alone, understood exactly what that gift meant, and she gave it not as a rich woman's charity but as very nearly a grandmother's love, because that by now was what she had become. But the thing Eleanor did that meant the most to Della, the thing that made the young widow weep at her own kitchen table, was the thing she did for Sam. Because Eleanor had listened, that first afternoon over tea, to the story of the firefighter who ran toward people, and she had understood that the deepest wound in Della's life was not the poverty at all. It was the grief, and the fear that her hero husband would be forgotten, that his daughter would grow up knowing him only as a folded flag on a shelf. And so Eleanor Ashcroft established a foundation, a real and lasting and richly funded one, and she named it the Sam Monroe Foundation, and its purpose was to care for the families of firefighters and rescue workers who had died in the line of duty, the way no one had properly cared for Della. It would pay the debts that crushed the widows. It would send the children to school. It would make sure that no other family who lost their hero to the fire would have to lose their home, and their future along with him. And Eleanor asked Della gently whether she would consider leaving the diner and the cleaning work behind, not to sit idle, never that, but to run it. To lead the Sam Monroe Foundation herself. Who better, Eleanor said, to care for the families of fallen heroes than a woman who had been one, and survived it, and never once stopped being kind through all of it? Who better to find the widows drowning in that terrible arithmetic than the woman who had done that arithmetic at her own kitchen table for 3 long years? And so Della Monroe, who had spent 3 years scrubbing other people's floors and waiting other people's tables, became the director of a foundation that carried her husband's name and did her husband's work, that ran toward the families everyone else ran away from. It was not charity. It was not a handout. It was the truest and most dignified gift there is. The gift of meaningful work that honored everything she was and everything she had lost. Sam's name would not fade into a folded flag on a shelf. Sam's name would be spoken with gratitude, for years and years to come, in the homes of hundreds of grieving families who would be caught and held and lifted, in their worst hour, because a firefighter once ran into a burning building, and because his widow once knelt down in the rain for a stranger. Della's last day at Gus's diner was a quiet, tender thing. She had not wanted a fuss, but word had traveled, the way it does in a warm, greasy, friendly place, and the regulars came in that day, and old Walter with his single cup of coffee, and Gus, who had slipped extra food into her box for 3 years and pretended not to. And when Della hung up her apron for the last time, Gus, gruff old Gus who never showed a thing, had to turn away and busy himself at the grill. And when he turned back his eyes were wet, and he said, "You were the best I ever had, Della. And not because of the tables. Because of what you did for the sad ones who came in that door. This place is gonna miss its heart." And Della hugged the old man and she said, "You gave me a job when I had nothing, Gus, and you slipped money in my jar thinking I didn't see. I saw. I always saw." And she promised him she would be back as a customer now, for his terrible wonderful coffee. And she kept that promise, because Della Monroe did not become too grand for the people who had held her up when she was low. That is the thing the money never changed about her. Not for one single day. She had been lifted, but she never once forgot the hands that had lifted her when she was down in the cold, and she never once looked down on anyone still there. She told Maisie about the new work by taking her to see her father's name on the wall. She knelt down beside her daughter the way she had knelt in the rain, and she said, "You see that name, baby? That's Daddy. And this whole place, everything we're going to do here, it's going to help families like ours, families who lost their hero the way we lost ours, so they don't have to be scared and alone the way we were. That's Mommy's job now. To do for other families what nobody could do for us. Isn't that something?" And Maisie looked at her father's name carved into the wall, and then up at her mother, and she said, with the solemn certainty of a 6-year-old who understands more than anyone thinks, "Daddy would like that." And Della had to hold her daughter tight for a moment because that was the whole of it, right there. Daddy would like that. Sam Monroe, who ran toward people, would have liked that very much indeed. And the work itself gave Della something that no check ever could have. It gave her purpose and dignity, and a way to turn the worst thing that had ever happened to her into shelter for others. She was not a charity case who had been rescued by a rich woman's whim. She was the director of a foundation, a woman with a mission and a title and a reason to get up in the morning that was bigger than mere survival. She was good at it, too, ferociously good, because she knew this terrain from the inside, knew the terrible arithmetic and the shame and the grief, knew exactly what a drowning widow needed to hear and exactly what she needed done. Eleanor, watching her work, said more than once that finding Della had been the single best decision she had made in 50 years of business, and she did not mean it kindly. She meant it as a hard-eyed judgment of talent. Della Monroe had been a great leader all along, buried under poverty and grief, and all it had taken was one person to see the treasure inside the plain and dusty shell, and to crack it open, and to let out everything that had been growing in there unseen the whole time. Della stood at the ribbon-cutting of the foundation's first office with Maisie's small hand in hers and Eleanor Ashcroft beside her, and she looked at her husband's name carved into the wall, and she understood that the seed she had planted on that cold and rainy night, asking nothing, had grown into something that would feed hundreds of families through the coldest winters of their lives. The great heavy golden fruit had come up out of the plain and frozen soil at last. And it was enough and more than enough, and it would go on giving forever. But I would be telling this story wrong, my friends, if I let you believe that the money was the harvest. The money was only the smallest part of it, the part the world can see and count. The true harvest, the golden heart inside the fruit, was something no amount of money could ever have bought, and it was this. 2 lonely, grieving souls and 1 motherless little girl became a family. That is what really grew from the cold and rainy night. Not a foundation, not a fortune, not a house with the deed in the right name. A family. Because Eleanor Ashcroft did not save Della and then vanish back into her gleaming tower, the grateful rich woman's debt discharged. Eleanor could not stay away. She had spent 80 years surrounded by people and profoundly alone, and in that small warm house she had found, at the very end of her life, the belonging she had never known she was starving for. So she came back. Again and again. She would have Foster drive her out to the little house at the edge of town, and she would sit at Della's kitchen table drinking tea, and she would let Maisie tell her long serious stories about her stuffed rabbit and her days at school, and she would listen to every word as though it were the most important thing in the world, because to her it was. Maisie, who had never had a grandmother, called her Nana Eleanor, and Eleanor Ashcroft, who had negotiated with the powerful of the earth, said that of all the titles she had ever held in her long and formidable life, Nana was the only one that had ever made her cry. She taught the little girl to play chess and to bake, and to tell a real friend from a false one. She became, in every way that matters, the child's grandmother and Della's mother, and the missing piece that all 3 of their broken hearts had been aching for. The old woman with the plain, weathered, overlooked shell had cracked open, and all the sweetness that a hard, cold world had kept locked inside her for 80 years came pouring out, at last, onto the 2 people who had never wanted anything from her but her company. I want to tell you about their first holiday together, because it holds the whole of what they had found. When the cold weather came around again, Eleanor came to the little house at the edge of town to spend the holiday, and she could have hosted them all, of course, in any of the grand and gleaming places she owned, with caterers and crystal and a tree that reached the ceiling. But she asked instead if she might simply come to Della's, to the small warm kitchen where she had been made whole. And Della cooked, on her own stove in her own home, the finest meal she could manage, And it was not grand, but it was made with love, and the three of them, the old woman and the young widow and the little girl, sat around that small table where 2 bowls had once been all it held, and it was full now, brimming full, of food and of laughter and of family. Eleanor told them that evening about the holidays of her past, the enormous formal dinners with 50 important guests and not one true friend, the beautiful lonely rooms, the way she had sat at the head of a long glittering table year after year, and felt like the loneliest woman in the world. And now, she said, looking around that small crowded kitchen with its steamed-up windows and its mismatched plates, now I know what all of that was missing. And her voice caught. It was missing this. It was missing being somewhere I was wanted for nothing but myself. She had brought gifts, but she had learned by then how to give them the right way. For Maisie there was not some extravagant pile of expensive things, but one gift, chosen with great care, a beautiful set of storybooks, and inside the front cover of each one Eleanor had written a note in her own hand, so that the child would always have her grandmother's words, and her grandmother's love, right there on the page. And for Della, Eleanor gave the gift that made the young widow weep at the table. She had found, through the fire department, a photograph that Della had never seen, taken the year before Sam died, of Sam in his gear at the firehouse, laughing that big open laugh of his, caught in a moment of pure joy. And Eleanor had had it restored and framed in a beautiful simple frame, and she gave it to Della, and she said, I never got to meet your Sam, but I have come to know him through you and through your girl, and through the good he is still doing in the world with his name. I thought you should have him laughing, my dear. Not just folded on a shelf. And Della held that photograph of her laughing husband and could not speak, and Eleanor put an arm around her. And Maisie climbed up into her mother's lap to see her daddy laughing. And the three of them sat there in the warm little kitchen and cried and laughed at the same time, the way you do when a grief is finally being held by enough love to bear it. And before they ate, Eleanor asked if she might say something, and she raised her glass and she said to Sam Monroe, who ran into the fire, and to the wife he left behind, who never once stopped running toward people, even when the whole world gave her every reason to stop. You saved a stranger in the rain, Della, and you have no idea, even now, how many lives that one act has already touched, and will go on touching long after all of us are gone. She looked at the young widow with her whole cracked open heart. I was as good as dead in that gutter, she said, and you did not just save my life. You gave me a family at the very end of mine, when I had given up believing I would ever have one. So this old woman is going to say the thing she should have said to more people sooner. Thank you. And Della raised her own glass, tears streaming, and said, to family. The one you're born with, and the one that finds you in the rain. And the three of them drank to that, in a small warm kitchen at the edge of a great cold city. And if you had looked through that steamed-up window from the dark street outside, you would never have guessed that one of the 3 richest-hearted people at that table happened also to be one of the richest women in the country. You would just have seen a family. Which is exactly, in the end, what they were. And Della, for her part, did the thing that the truly kind always do with a harvest. She planted it forward. Running the Sam Monroe Foundation, she went looking deliberately now for the people she had once been, the widows and the widowers drowning in the terrible arithmetic, the children about to lose their homes along with their heroes. And there was one in that first year that I want to tell you about because it is the whole of this story folded into a single afternoon. A young widow named Anna, whose husband had died in a warehouse fire. A woman with 2 small children and a stack of bills and a face that Della recognized instantly, because it was her own face from 3 years before, gray with grief and fear and exhaustion. And Della went to her personally. She did not send a check in the mail. She went and she sat down at Anna's kitchen table, and she looked at the same terrible arithmetic she had once done herself, and she said the words that no one had said to her when she needed them most. You are not alone anymore. I have got you. We are going to catch you. And she meant it with everything in her, because she had once knelt in the rain and said almost exactly those words to a stranger, and she knew better than anyone alive what they were worth. She did more for Anna than write a check, though the checks were written and the debts were cleared. She sat with her week after week through the worst of the grief, the way someone should have sat with Della 3 years before. She brought Maisie along sometimes, And Maisie played with Anna's two small children, teaching them the card game that Nana Eleanor had taught her, so that the kindness passed down not only from Della to Anna but from child to child, one generation of the grieving quietly holding up the next. And here is the thing that moved Della most of all, the thing that told her the seed was truly taking root and not just landing. About a year after Della first knelt at Anna's kitchen table, Anna came to the foundation and asked shyly whether she might volunteer. Because she had been caught when she was falling, she said, and now she wanted to help catch someone else. And Della watched Anna go out, in time, to sit at the kitchen tables of other new widows, to look at their terrible arithmetic and say the words that had once been said to her. You are not alone anymore, I have got you. We are going to catch you. The one who had been saved became one who saved. The harvest had produced its own seeds, and those seeds had been planted, and they had grown, and they were producing seeds of their own now, farther out than Della could see. That is the miracle of the 100 seeds inside the humble fruit, my friends. You do not just help one person. You start something that goes on helping hand to hand, heart to heart, table to table, long after you have lost sight of where it went. And little Maisie grew up in the middle of all of it, which was, in the end, perhaps the finest harvest of them all. She grew up watching her mother kneel down for the fallen, watching Nana Eleanor's fortune turned into shelter for the grieving, watching a whole world built out of the simple stubborn refusal to walk past a person in need. She grew up knowing exactly who her father had been, not as a folded flag on a shelf, but as a living idea she saw acted out in front of her every single day. Look for the people who are struggling. And if you can help them even a little, you help them. Della had made her that promise beside a fire helmet she could not give away, in the hardest years of her life, and she had kept it, not with words but with a whole life lived out loud. And Maisie, that bright, watchful, tender-hearted little girl, was going to grow up to be exactly the kind of person who stops in the rain. The seed of Sam Monroe and of Della Monroe, and of a cold and rainy night, was planted deep and safe in the good soil of a child's heart, where it would grow and be planted again, for generations none of them would ever live to see. That is how the truly good ones cheat death, my friends. Not by living forever. By planting themselves in the ones who come after. The seed had come full circle. The kindness that Della had planted on a cold and rainy night, and that Eleanor had grown into a great golden harvest, was now being scattered again, by Della's own hand, into 100 new patches of frozen and hopeless soil, where it would grow and be scattered again on, farther than any of them would ever be able to see. That is how kindness works, my friends. That is the secret of the 100 seeds inside the humble fruit. It never stops at one harvest. Planted once in good soil, it feeds the world forever. Eleanor Ashcroft lived several more good years, better years than any she had known before, rich not in the way the world had always called her rich, but rich in the way that actually matters, in tea at a small kitchen table and a child's arms around her neck and a family that loved her for exactly nothing at all. And when at last she passed, peacefully, an old woman surrounded by people who genuinely grieved her, she went knowing that her empire was safe in Claire's good hands, and that the finest thing she had ever done with all her vast fortune was not any of the companies she had built or the deals she had made. It was the quiet foundation that bore a firefighter's name. And it was the family she had found at the very end, in the unlikeliest house in the city, because she had fallen down in the rain in front of the one woman on earth whose heart was already shaped to stop. Eleanor left Della a letter, to be opened after she was gone, and Della kept it in the frame beside the photograph of Sam laughing. And read it on the hard days, and I will tell you a little of what it said, because it is the truest summing up of this whole story. My dear Della, it began. When you knelt down for me in the rain, you thought you were saving the life of a stranger. You were. But you were also saving me in a way you could not have known. For 80 years I believed that the world was a market, and that every person in it, if you looked closely enough, was selling something. You taught me at the very end that I was wrong, that there are people who give for nothing, who stop for nothing, who love for nothing, and that these people are the only truly rich ones there have ever been. You made me one of them in my last years, and it is the only fortune I have ever been proud of. Do not grieve me too long. Look instead at what we built, and at that beautiful girl, and know that a poor tired widow with an empty cupboard changed more lives, with one act of kindness on one cold night, than I did with a lifetime and a fortune. Go on stopping, my darling. The world has so few who will. Oh, my love, your Eleanor. And Della did go on stopping for the rest of her life, and she raised a daughter who stopped, and she built a foundation full of people who stopped. And somewhere in all of that, the fierce old woman who had died in a warm bed surrounded by love went on living, the way the good ones do, in the kindness they leave planted behind them. It was the quiet foundation that bore a firefighter's name. And so that is where the story of Della Monroe and Eleanor Ashcroft comes to rest. But before I take you back out to my pumpkin patch one last time, I want to gather up the lessons of it, because I think this is a story the whole tired world needs to hear. The first lesson is the one that Della lived every single day of her hard life, without ever once thinking of it as a lesson. It is that kindness is a seed, and you plant it because that is simply what a good heart does, not because you expect a harvest. Della did not kneel down in the rain because she calculated that the old woman might be wealthy. She knelt down because a person was hurting and she was someone who stops. She wanted nothing. And that, my friends, is the great and holy paradox at the heart of all real kindness. The reward comes precisely to those who were not seeking one. The moment you help someone in order to get something back, it stops being a seed of kindness and becomes a business transaction, and business transactions do not grow into great golden harvests. They just get you paid. Della got so much more than paid because Della was not doing business. She was just being who she was. The second lesson is the one about the plain skin and the treasure inside, and it cuts two ways, so hold on to both. On the one hand, there was Eleanor, lying ruined and filthy on that street, and 100 comfortable people judged the plainness of her skin and decided there was nothing inside worth stopping for, and they were catastrophically wrong. Do not ever, my friends, judge the worth of a soul by the state of their clothes, or the dirt on their face, or the poverty of their circumstances. The most overlooked, dismissed, stepped-around person on your street may be carrying more treasure inside them than you can imagine, and I do not mean money. I mean their whole precious human life, which is worth stopping for no matter what their skin looks like. But the lesson cuts the other way too, because there was also Della, the poor tired widow that the world would also have passed right by, and inside her plain overlooked life was the finest heart in this whole story. The world is full of humble, dusty, overlooked pumpkins, my friends, and so very many of them are full to bursting with gold. Learn to stop reaching only for the shiny ones. Learn to really look at what is inside. And the third lesson is the one that Eleanor learned in 11 cold and terrible days. The lesson that the true test of the people around you is not how they treat you when you are strong and useful, but how they treat you when you are lost and worth nothing to them. Roland searched for the fortune. Foster and Claire searched for the woman. And a stranger who owed her nothing gave her everything. When the hard day comes in your own life, and it comes for all of us, pay very close attention to who walks the streets for you and who works the phones for your inheritance. It will tell you everything. And in the meantime, be the kind of person who searches for the soul and not the fortune, who stops for the person and not the payoff, because we do, every one of us, reap exactly what we plant. Della planted kindness in frozen soil for 3 long years, and reaped a harvest that fed hundreds. Roland planted greed, and reaped an empty exit through a closing door. The soil does not lie and it does not forget. It gives you back, in the end, precisely what you put into it. So now let me carry you back one last time, out to my pumpkin patch, to this great heavy golden fruit I can barely lift into my basket. Do you remember where it began? One tiny, flat, unremarkable little seed, a thing that looked like nothing at all. That was Della's kindness on a cold and rainy night. So small. So plain. A coat given, a hand held out, a few whispered words, "You are safe, I have got you." It looked like nothing. It cost her nearly everything she had, and it looked like nothing. And she planted it in the unlikeliest soil in the whole world, in a ruined stranger everyone else had passed by, expecting no harvest at all. And look what grew. Look at this great golden thing. A life saved, a fortune's soul redeemed, a family found, a foundation that will feed the grieving for generations, and 100 seeds scattered onward into 100 new patches of frozen ground. All of it, from one plain little seed planted in the cold, asking nothing. And do you remember the dusty, humble skin of the pumpkin? And the gold hidden inside it? That was Eleanor, whom the world saw as a beggar and who was a treasure. And that was Della, whom the world saw as a nobody and who was the richest-hearted soul in this whole story. Do not judge the fruit by the skin, my friends. Not ever. And do you remember the low, humble vine, the one that stays close to the ground and asks for nothing, and bears the very heaviest fruit of the whole garden? That was Della Monroe exactly. Humble and low and close to the ground, carrying quietly the greatest treasure in the story, which was her own unbreakable, unrewarded, running toward people kindness. The heaviest gold grows on the humblest vine. It always has. It always will. So the next time the world tempts you to measure your own worth by how little you have, remember Della Monroe, low and humble and close to the ground, carrying quietly the greatest treasure in this whole story. What you own is not your worth. What you give is your worth. And by that measure, the poorest woman in this story was from the very beginning the richest soul in it. So let me ask you something before you go tonight, and please do tell me because I read every single answer. Have you ever been the one who stopped when everyone else kept walking? Or have you ever been the one on the ground in the cold, praying that just one soul would stop for you? Tell me. And tell me honestly, would you have stopped on that rainy night, for the ruined old woman everyone else stepped around? It is easy to say yes sitting warm where you are. But the true test comes on the cold dark street, when you are tired and poor and afraid, and it would be so very easy to keep walking. I hope when your night comes you will remember Della and stop. And tell me one more thing too. Do you believe that kindness comes back to you in the end the way it came back to Della? Or do you believe, as I have come to believe, that the truly good ones give without any thought of return at all, and that the harvest when it comes is only ever a surprise? There is no wrong answer. I only want to know what is in your heart. Tell me down in the comments, along with the name of the place you are listening from tonight, because it warms this old heart of mine to know how far we have all traveled together, gathered around these stories from every corner of the world. If this one reached you, if it made you want to be the one who stops, then do an old gardener a kindness and leave a like so that someone else who needs to hear it can find their way to it too. Subscribe and stay close because there is always another seed to plant out here, and always another harvest coming in. Take gentle care of yourselves, my friends. Plant your kindness in the cold and ask for nothing. And when you pass someone on the ground in the rain, be the one who stops. And I will see you on the next one.